Well, there is much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us from Jerusalem is political strategist Jeremy Saltan. Also with us from Jerusalem is journalist and social activist Tammi Molad Hayo. Attorney Moien Odeh joins us from Ramallah. His focus includes human rights and international law. And Emmanuel Navon is a senior fellow at the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security and the Kohelet Policy Center. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Emmanuel Navon, let me start with you. Benjamin Netanyahu looks set for a fifth record term as Israel's prime minister. How do you explain this? How do you explain the man's popularity with the Israeli voters?
I wouldn't say necessarily his popularity, but the fact that Israeli voters, when they have to decide between him and his opponents, I think realize, most of them, I mean a majority of Israeli voters obviously, that the balance sheet is a good one, that Israel has never done better internationally. Its economy is also doing very well. And it wasn't clear from the other main candidate, Benny Gantz, what his alternative was in terms of foreign policy, in terms of economic policy. And so even though Netanyahu has been in power already for 10 years, I think that most Israelis realized that his record is overall a very good one and wanted him to keep on going, even when they are critical of him, whether it is because of his personal behavior or some aspects of his policy here and there. But I think overall, a majority of Israelis figured that they were in safe hands.
Tammi, was that Benny Gantz's big failure here, his downfall, that he failed to articulate clear policies that were alternatives to what Benjamin Netanyahu was offering?
I think so, yeah. I think that the problem was that no one really put out an alternative. The problem is not just the persona who's going to be the alternative. It's also what exactly are they going to do? And we know exactly what Netanyahu is doing. We know exactly what he will not do. And we also know about Netanyahu that he will do whatever he can just to keep on not doing whatever is humanly possible not to do. So in that sense, he's the safest choice for Israelis. And Gantz was, that was a big mistake by Gantz and his crew.
Jeremy Saltan, if all goes according to what we're predicting right now, that Benjamin Netanyahu will form the next government, the previous coalition included a party that was openly racist. We would have the most right-wing government in history. What does this tell us about the Israeli electorate?
Sure. I mean, I heard what both Tammi and Emmanuel was saying about Gantz, but I actually think Gantz did better than he could, than most people expected him to. He was able to lead his faction to 35 seats. That is quite significant. As you mentioned, we have an electorate in Israel that has voted for right-wing governments, and when we're looking at the other parties that got into the parliament, we see a very clear slant towards the right-wing parties. In fact, Gantz receiving the 35 seats that he did lowered his potential coalition partners' ability to get enough seats to be able to be competitive against the bloc that Netanyahu represents, which is the right wing. I think the coalition that we are going to see in this next government is going to be very much the same coalition that we saw in the previous government, more or less the same players, plus or minus a few personalities.
Jeremy, is it a bit of a mistake for us to put labels on these things like left-wing, right-wing, or centrist, or whatever the case may be, when the primary reason people vote is because, I guess, it's security in Israel? That's the big issue, isn't it?
Well, as you said, the big issue is security. And if we're saying right and left, we're talking about it on the axis of security, national defense, and diplomacy issues. I agree with you that in terms of economic issues, it's not fair to use that association of right and left. However, that was not the reason Israelis went to vote on the economy. The economy is good. There doesn't seem to be any real, what I would say, issues that were brought up throughout the campaign by any of the parties in terms of where our economy is. We are at a record low in terms of unemployment. The situation for most Israelis is good. The government has been able to provide a very stable economy for a majority of its citizens. What Israelis do fear is the security situation. We have a lot of neighbors on our borders that are not the most friendly, and when they went to the ballot box yesterday, that was the primary thing that they were thinking about. And when we're talking about right or left, so we're talking specifically on the security axis.
All right, let me bring in Moien Odeh. He's in Ramallah. And Moien, the Palestinian chief negotiator, Saeb Erekat, he was responding to the outcome of the election, and this is what he said. He said, Israelis have voted to preserve the status quo. They have said no to peace and yes to occupation. Let me ask you this first, Moien. When you hear what Saeb Erekat said there, if Benny Gantz had got more seats than he did, would the Palestinians have seen that as a yes to peace and a no to occupation?
Well, I think if Benny Gantz had got more seats, or maybe if the left-center coalition had got more seats than it got, maybe they could see it as a change that could lead to yes. Like, you cannot say that, yeah, that was the direct answer, that yes, but at least they could say that the results is a clear answer that the Israeli society is not interested to make any change in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or any change in the Israeli policy towards Palestinians. So this is the main issue, is that the Israeli society decided that Netanyahu should continue in his office and continue treating Palestinians in his way and keep the status quo on status as it is, and not dreaming about peace or about anything else. I would like to say that security that my colleagues were speaking about will never be achieved by Netanyahu. Netanyahu was in the office for 10 years, and before that he was a few years before that. And security will never be achieved by using power or using punishment for Palestinians. Security will be giving justices for everybody, including the Palestinians, for sure.
Right, Emmanuel Navon, let's look at the conduct of this election. Let's look at the Arab-Israeli vote. Netanyahu's Likud party provided activists with 1,200 hidden cameras to, quote, monitor polling stations where many Arabs were voting. The Central Elections Committee in Israel actually said that this is a violation of Israeli election law. Was this an attempt to intimidate Arab voters and suppress the Arab vote? In fact, Haaretz newspaper calls it totalitarian, the mark of a dictator.
Well, I think if the purpose was to intimidate, those cameras would not have been hidden. I mean, obviously, if they're hidden, they cannot intimidate. I think that this decision by Likud was a mistake. It was condemned by the Central Committee. Again, as I said, if the purpose was to intimidate, hiding them would have defeated the purpose. Luckily, they were removed, as they should have been, and the election proceeded properly throughout the country, and the Arab population, that the rest of the population in Israel voted and chose their own representatives in the Knesset, as it has been since Israel's independence.
So I take your point about the cameras being hidden, but why do you think Likud did this?
I don't know why they did it. I think that it was a mistake to do so, and I think that if the purpose is to monitor what is going on in the different polls throughout the country, then there should be cameras everywhere and not only in certain sectors of the population.
Yeah, these cameras were in places, we're told, where there was a predominance of Arab voters. Jeremy, what is your view on the use of cameras there? In fact, Haaretz newspaper also reported ballot irregularities in Rishon LeZion. Ballots apparently did not have the symbol of the blue and white party, the opposition party. And I'm wondering, to what extent does this put any kind of a question mark over the validity of the outcome of the vote?
There's no question mark in terms of validity of this vote. In every Israeli election, this is the 21st Knesset, the first 20 elections before that, you're always going to have some sort of irregularities. This is not something that is unusual. It is part of the norm. That is why you have the Central Elections Committee, which is made up of all of the parties, participation of everybody, Arab parties, ultra-Orthodox, Jewish, religious, secular. Everyone has participation on the committee. It is chaired by a Supreme Court justice, and it is, does a very good job, because the fact that you have an address to go to, such as the terrible thing that you mentioned in terms of the cameras, which apparently were in a few of the Arab polling stations, that you have an address to complain to, and then they're able to go ahead and deal with it during the vote, as opposed to waiting till after the vote. I think that shows what a strong democracy Israel is, that you have the ability to both complain and also see that the authorities comply with what is needed to uphold the democratic process.
Yeah, the reason, Jeremy, I raised the question of validity is the fact that, as you point out, there is a place you can go and complain, and the commission, or the committee rather, has already said that this is a violation of Israeli law. I'm wondering, will someone pay the penalty for that?
Oh, I'm sure that there will be a penalty to pay for that. Throughout the election campaign, and it's important we mention that, not just Election Day itself, throughout the campaign there has been a long list of different infractions in terms of things that other parties have done. Likud has systematically done more than a lot of the other parties, and they've had to pay fines. Sometimes they had to actually have more significant prices. They had one of the candidates on their list who actually had to resign and not run for Knesset because of irregularity with his own candidacy. So again, throughout this process over the last three and a half months, we've had a working Central Elections Committee, which is impartial, which has been dealing with the entire process leading up to the election day itself, as well as the election day.
Right, Tammy, the election is now over, but prior to the election, Prime Minister Netanyahu said he would annex the occupied West Bank if re-elected. Let's listen to what he said.
I am going to extend Israeli sovereignty, and I don't distinguish between settlement blocks and isolated settlements. In my opinion, each block is an Israeli area and is under Israeli control. I won't move these blocks to the Palestinian Authority.
So, Tammy, can we expect Israel to annex the West Bank now that the election's over?
Oh, no. No, of course not. It was an election promise. He has absolutely no intention of delivering. And by the way, even if he does have an intention, he has no way of doing it because his best new friend Trump will never allow it. We're all waiting now for the deal of the century that Trump is going to the peace deal that Trump is supposed to release. And we know that annexation of the settlements is not part of this deal. We also know that Jerusalem is going to be on the table. Another thing that Netanyahu will not be able to deliver. So we're going to face some very troubling water up ahead. And the very right-wing, extremely right-wing government that Netanyahu is forming now is going to pose a lot of problems for him in regards to the relationship with America, with the United States, with the Palestinians, actually with the whole world.
Moien Odeh, we did hear Benjamin Netanyahu make that election pledge that he would annex the West Bank. As we heard Tammy just point out, that's not going to happen. That's election rhetoric. But this is how the Palestinian Foreign Minister Riyad al-Malik responded to Netanyahu's annexation plan. Let's watch this.
We are not surprised. We expected that. Netanyahu has been saying that for the last 20 years. Maybe not publicly, but this time, he was encouraged by Trump's policies and Trump's actions when Trump decided to recognize Jerusalem as capital of Israel and Israeli sovereignty over the occupied Golan Syrian Heights. He felt, why not?
So, Moien Odeh, what's your view on that? Do you think the West Bank will be annexed?
Well, first of all, we should remember that de facto, the settlements and Area C, almost they are annexed, like without announcing it and without using legal terms. Everybody living in the West Bank understand that the settlements and the settlers are part of Israel, and Israel is dealing with them as part of it. This is one. The biggest fear for the Palestinians is yes, that there's a big fear that at least the big settlements blocks will be annexed, and the fear also that Trump administration will recognize this annexation. I hope what Tammy said will be correct, and that it was only an elections promises, and that will never happen. and that the deal of century will make a difference on the ground. But the biggest fear is that the Israeli government, or the right-wing Israeli government, is going to do it because they are afraid that Trump administration will not stay for a long time, so they want to take advantage of this administration as much as they can. And the best thing that can do for themselves is to annex at least the settlements and Jordan Valley area and get the American recognition on that.
Emmanuel Navon, President Trump has a very close relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Under President Trump, of course, the Israelis have moved at least the United States has moved the embassy to Jerusalem, also recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Do you think the relationship between Trump and Netanyahu played any role in Netanyahu's victory in this election?
I don't think so. I don't think that when Israelis went to the polls yesterday, they were influenced one way or the other by President Trump. What they were influenced by, however, was the excellent record of Netanyahu internationally, not only with the United States, but also with Russia, with India, with China, now also with African countries and South America. In other words, one of the reasons why most Israelis decided to re-elect Netanyahu is because of his international record, and that is not only his relationship with President Trump, but with most world leaders. There are very few leaders in the world today who can just pick up their phone and speak directly and immediately with Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, President Xi of China, most European leaders, and Israelis recognize that.
Jeremy, here in the United States, it's not very often that we hear very overt criticism of Israeli politicians, very personal criticism from members of political parties here in the United States. But one of the candidates, Democrat candidates, running for president, Beto O'Rourke, has called Benjamin Netanyahu a racist. Let's listen to what he said.
The U.S.-Israel relationship is one of the most important relationships that we have on the planet. And that relationship, if it is to be successful, must transcend partisanship in the United States, and it must be able to transcend a prime minister who is racist, as he warns about Arabs coming to the polls, who wants to defy any prospect for peace as he threatens to annex the West Bank, and who has sided with a far-right racist party in order to maintain his hold on power.
So, Jeremy, what do you make of that?
Well, there are about 20 people, I think, right now running for the Democrat Party nomination for president. We're talking about a candidate here who could not even win a Senate seat in Texas. So I'm not exactly sure how much support he has within his own party. I know that most of the people that I speak to in the Democrat Party do view as the beginning of O'Rourke's statement was that this is one of the most, if not the most important relationship, rather, for America, the relationship between America and Israel. So I'm not particularly worried about what one of 20 candidates is saying in that regard, but I do know that there is a certain segment within that party, and for sure within the American discourse, that believes that. But I reject that. I don't think that Netanyahu is a racist.
Moien, what did you make of what Beto O'Rourke said about Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, it's not the first time. Like, if you go to the previous elections when Mr. Netanyahu was speaking that Arabs are running through buses, and he asked his supporters to run and to vote for him. Again, in these elections, he used different terms against Arabs, saying that Arabs are not unequal citizens or something like that. He said that it's a Jewish state and only for Jewish people, which means that the other ethnicities here are not part of the state. Everybody could understand his speech differently, but I think Mr. Netanyahu is trying to get, at least what he's saying is try to get the racist voters in the Israeli society to vote for him to be again in the office for another 4 years.
Emmanuel, as we look at Israel and the future of Israel after this election, there is one cloud which is sitting over Benjamin Netanyahu, and that is he's facing bribery and fraud charges. The Attorney General of the country has announced his intention to indict the Prime Minister. Is there a scenario that you could see where Netanyahu would not be able to finish out or serve out his term?
First of all, the Attorney General has announced his decision to indict the Prime Minister pending a hearing. And this procedure of a hearing, there have been many cases in the past where after the hearing, the Attorney General decided to drop the case. So Netanyahu might and might not be indicted. We don't know yet. That's first of all. Second of all, assuming, let's say that the Attorney General, after a hearing, decides to indict the Prime Minister by law, the Prime Minister does not have to resign if indicted. He only has to resign if he is convicted. And the whole legal process can take a while. And again, it depends on which case, if the Attorney General decides to indict the Prime Minister, will it be on a serious one or a minor one? If it's on a minor one, I think most Israelis would say, you know, we just re-elected him with a very clear majority. He can carry on the one hand, running the country, and if he has to defend himself in court on a minor issue, I think most Israelis would accept that. If it's on a major case, on the Bezek one, which is called Case 4000, he might be dropped by at least some of his coalition partners, but it's too early to know because, as I said, first there has to be a hearing, and nobody knows if the Attorney General will maintain his decision to indict the Prime Minister or not. And again, the bottom line is that by law, the Prime Minister only has to resign if convicted, not if indicted.
Right, Tammi, what do you make of that? As Emmanuel tells us, you know, the Prime Minister does not have to resign if there is an indictment, but that's the legal reasoning. What about the politics of it all? What does this look like politically?
Well, that's the point where we can connect all the dots. The reason that Netanyahu was making all kinds of protests against Arabs or saying things that might sound racist, even though he is not a racist himself, in order to bring into the coalition the most extreme right parties, it's in order to save himself, because he's facing 3 different cases. All 3 of them are rather, they're not minor cases, they're rather serious. And it's true, he doesn't have to resign, but the only way he can survive the next 4 years as Prime Minister is if they will use the immunity clause. There is a law giving immunity to members of Knesset, and the right-wing parties have already said that they're going to try and see if Netanyahu can go into this law, if they can make it work for him. So that's what these elections were all about. Because the truth is, we were not supposed to have elections now. We were supposed to have them in about 6 months, even a little longer than that. That the whole reason we had elections this April is because Netanyahu thought it would be best to have the election before the hearings. And he was probably right, because right now there are members of Knesset already seeing and trying to see if they can give him immunity. That's the whole reason. It's not about Palestinians, it's not about economy, it's not about international relationship, it's just about one thing, the cases against Netanyahu.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arlen Gneider in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.